estrangement. Basically what he's trying to say is, when you say science fiction, we get these images of flying saucers and aliens and space invasions and things like that. And it seems very far removed from our reality. And this is, science fiction is a literature that employs this technique of placing the reader in an unfamiliar or different world. Through this, the reader can view the real world from a fresh perspective and recognize its failings and shortcomings. Thomas Gunn echoes this view by characterizing science fiction as a literature set in different worlds and in different ways that invite the reader to interrogate these differences and to ask hard questions about them and what they can tell us about our own world. So, looking back on science fiction in these terms, people are starting to realize that a lot of what science fiction does is critiquing or making a commentary on our society and actually satirizing them. But if they present a utopia, then what it does is it's starkly contrasted with the world that we are in. And it is within those differences that it is actually trying to make a critique of the society, that this is where we are falling short, or this is where we are not doing well enough. So these are the things how science fiction is being looked at. Now, you can look at a lot of books that perhaps you recognize, like say Frankenstein or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which are really, really popular. Even those things are now being looked back as something far more important. Like, for example, Frankenstein, it speaks a lot about the paradoxical situation that was there during those times about the birth of science, and you still have tradition, basically much like when we talk about the Victorian compromise and all of that. So you had science and traditional belief at loggerheads, and like, so out of that fear of the next thing that was happening, which was science, which was slowly overtaking even religion. So the fear that comes out of it is what produces something like Frankenstein. So the study in that becomes really interesting. Now, more to the theme of what we have for this seminar about indigenous and indigenous cultures. Now, it is of interest, it is a very interesting fact that the first, one of the very earliest established, recognized science fiction books actually has this for a theme. Basically about colonization and imperialism. I think you all know this book. It's called War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It has been remade into plays and movies many different times, and of late it's been made into a movie starring Tom Cruise and all of that. Now, what they did right with that movie is the fact that they were able to capture the fear and the sense of futility as human beings fighting against a vastly superior technological race. What H.G. Wells meant to do with that. Now, when we read at how even the book begins, he says, before we judge the Martians, it was the Martians that had come to Earth to basically conquer all of Earth and use the Earthlings as slaves or for production. Now he says, before we judge the Martians too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by the European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? So basically, what he's trying to do is his readers, which were basically the British people, the white Western cultures over there, what he's trying to do is place them in the unique situation of the same people that they are colonizing. What he was trying to critique here is, just a few years before the writing of this book in 1898, what happened was, the Britishers went to colonize Tasmania, and they managed to wipe out the entire Aborigines people there. So he was really shocked by it, and him writing this book was trying to place the British people, the colonizers, in that situation where the feeling of helplessness when someone comes and just invades you and takes over your land, he wanted them to feel that. That is why he wrote the book. And he said so in many subsequent interviews later. Now if we come more to, now this sort of invasion tales is a dime a dozen when it comes to science fiction, and all of it carried basically the same sort of premise that this War of the Worlds has established. Now, if we come now to more recent times, I think all of you have watched the movie Avatar. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, the recent movie Avatar. It won Oscars, it won 3 Oscars, I think. It's a really, popular movie. Now, let me just read to you the plot of the movie, and you can get the sense of how familiar it feels, especially for someone who's colonized. Basically, you have this planet called Pandora, which is inhabited by a native known as the Navi. Now they are a tree-dwelling race, hunter-gatherer, technologically backward. So what happens is they happen to have this mineral called unobtainium, which is very vital to, which is vital as an energy source. So a mining company from Earth goes there with engineers and anthropologists and the military, and they set up camp over there. And so they come with all the trappings of what colonizers usually do. They set up hospitals, they set up schools, trying to, basically change their mentality to the capitalist sort of mind frame. But what they're really there for is actually the mineral, and basically to try to replace the local Navi people so that they can get the mineral, and eventually the people fall back. So when you just look at even the plot of the movie itself, you realize that it is overtly a critique on imperialism and capitalism, as we know of today's world, and how these things are happening in places like Africa and even Asia, and and this becomes a critique and a satire of all those things that are happening there. Now, besides this narrative, however, there's something new that has come up of recent times known as indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism. This is much like how post-colonial studies write back. Basically, what indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism also does as well is it tries to write back to the science fiction genre. And today, in the earlier session, Estrin Kiri was talking about victimhood again. That presentation of indigenous people always as victims, always as noble savages, so to speak. Even when it's written in sympathetic mode, there's always that sense of the fact that we always needed to be saved, that we are noble savages, that we do not belong in a technologically advanced world within the future. And as an example, you have something like, there's a photograph of Geronimo in a Cadillac, and it upset a lot of white people, because there is this man in full red Indian regalia, and he's sitting on a Cadillac, and somehow they felt that was out of place. Okay, and that is how they view us, that we do not belong with that sort of future, with that sort of technology. So what indigenous futurism is trying is, change that discourse, change that, shift the paradigm. And when they write stories, they try to turn the gaze from the colonizer to the colonizee, and they reverse that. But the thing is, what we have to realize about this thing is that it, like Catherine Cornum writes, perhaps because science fiction is so prone to reproducing colonial desires, it has become seductive to the colonizee, who finds pleasure and power in reversing the telescope's gaze of who is exploring who. This reversal, however, is no mere trick. It is a profound deconstruction of how we imagine time, progress, and who is worthy of the future. Indigenous futurism questions accepted notions of what constitutes advanced technology and consequently advanced civilizations, seeing settler notions as both extractive and exploitative, and hence apocalyptic. Indigenous futurism seeks to redefine and overcome these by imagining different notions of progress and civilization. Now, advanced technology for indigenous futurists is not seen merely as an instrument of destruction, but as a means to foster and improve human-to-human relationships, and not just human-to-human relationships, more importantly, human to non-human relationships, and human relationships to the entire cosmos as a whole. So their approach to how they would say, like for example, narrative of, say, conquest or travel or exploration would be very different when an indigenous writer writes it as compared to, say, a white settler would. Because for them, it's not about conquest. It's not about simply just conquering some place and planting your flags over there. As they write, indigenous futurism does not care for speed as much as sustainability, not so much for progress as balance, and not for power, but relation. See, indigenous futurism is more than just putting an indigenous person in space. With travel and exploration comes the danger of exploitation and upheaval. Now, who is more acutely aware of this than somebody who's indigenous, who's been the victim of all these things, if I may use that word again. But indigenous writers imagine a different outcome to contact encounters that do not result in conquest, genocide, or violence. For an example, we have Robert Sullivan's epic poem. It's called the Star Waka. Now, I think we all know what the waka is, the Maori dance. But anyway, his poem speaks about how the Maori people are out in space trying to find a new home. But the thing is, with the Maori people, they're very close to their land, and they lived according to whatever their land is. Now, how does that person now live in space where the land is now, topography and everything is completely different? Who do they pray to now? All right? What becomes of their culture now? And these are the kind of ways that indigenous futurism approaches like going out into the stars and meeting new world. Unlike white people who's all like, I keep saying white people, I'm sorry. It's like, well, basically, instead of the traditional way, let's say, of science fiction, how science fiction is written, it's always about going to a place, conquering it. And not just conquering the people, but also conquering the environment to suit you, right? But the thing is, with indigenous futurism, it's not about conquering all those things, but adapting to those things, becoming one with those things. So that is how the approach is always very, very different. Again, in indigenous futurism, technology is inextricable from the social. In The Moons of Palmares, written by Zainab Ahmadais, it examines the relationships, both harmful and collaborative, between indigenous people and descendants of slaves in an outer space setting that merges history of the black descendants of slaves of the Black Atlantic with the colonial frontier. Now, on her writing, she stated that she aspires to write in a way that views possible alternatives through the lens of a relationship framework where she can demonstrate our connectivity to and interdependence with each other and the rest of our relations. Now, The Moon of Palmares works towards this end by revealing strong connections between indigenous and black histories, narratives, and way of living. Outer space, perhaps because of its appeal to our sense of endless possibility, has become the imaginative site for re-envisioning how black, indigenous, and other oppressed people can relate to each other outside of and despite the colonial gaze. Our collective refusal of colonial progress, namely our destruction, means we must chart other ways to the future that leads us and other oppressed people to worlds we deserve. Now, these alternative concepts of time reject the notion that all tradition is regressive by narrating futures intimately connected to the past. Science fiction, and specifically the side of outer space, give writers and thinkers the imagination room to envision political and cultural relationships and the future decolonizing movements they might nourish. This focus on relationship, especially as posited by Ahmadai, also accounts for those forms of indigeneity that persist among peoples either stolen from their lands or whose lands have been stolen from them. All right, so this, so the thing is, with indigenous futurism, basically it speaks of the Native American, whereas Afrofuturism speaks about the black people who, again, in Afrofuturism, they describe themselves as displaced indigenous people. So now this focus on relationship rather than a strict idea of location speaks to the way in which there can remain security in indigenous identity even while rocketing through dark skies far from their origins. This is not to demean the work of land protectors and defenders who risk serious repercussions for resisting corporate and state encroachment on indigenous territories. Besides supporting those who are able and choose to remain on the land, there's also the hope to broaden understandings of indigeneity outside simple location. Locations, of course, are never simple. It is the settler who wishes to flatten the relation between place and people by claiming land through ownership. Projecting themselves forward into faraway lands and times, indigenous futurism reveals the myriad ways of relating to land beyond property. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you all.
As a very important objective in the Indian development strategy, and I think we all understand what is urban poverty and all the difficulties like housing and urban basic services and deprivations and all that are faced in the urban areas, especially in the urban slums. So coming into the scenario of Mizoram, a little more than half of the population in Mizoram are supposed to be urban, and out of that, the Aizawl city houses a larger portion of the poor households. So in this study, what we've used is, I've used the urban livelihood framework, in which we assess livelihood, people's livelihoods, the livelihoods of individuals as well as households. And in this, we understand poverty not only in terms of economic deprivation, but in terms of what people have, what kind of resources that an individual or a household has, and how they make use of those resources. So in this way, poverty is not only understood as economic deprivation, but an entire lots of factors and strategies that people use to meet their livelihood goals and to survive. So we are basically looking at poverty from a livelihood approach. And for my study, the main objective is we want to probe into and understand the dynamics of the poor households in Mizoram, how they cope with their situation, and what kind of strategies that they use to face everyday life. So for this, I have used case studies. In my paper, I have presented 8 case vignettes. I will not go too much into detail into the cases. We have cases where there are single mothers struggling with poverty. We have people who have migrated from the rural areas and to access better education and health opportunities in the city. We have people who are poor, yet we have members who are alcoholics. They have to deal with it, and we have interviewed these families on various notes. We have asked them how they cope with everyday life, how do they survive on 300 rupees a day, and then they have we have come to understand the different coping strategies of these people. Some have said it's basically because we have migrated to the city that we are coping in a better way. Had we stayed in the village, we would still be very poor and very much deprived as compared to now. And they say hard work above all is the main coping strategy, and education. When we have educated our children, whether they get government jobs or not, they are educated, and this adds to the human capital of the household. And thrift, disciplining of the children, and family cohesion have been seen as very positive livelihood coping strategies of different households. So among this, okay, going back into the what I mentioned, the livelihood framework, sustainable livelihood framework, we assess people's livelihoods, households' livelihoods, into different kinds of resources, different kinds of capitals, which are financial capital, basically their access to the formal banking system, their savings and their expenditure and savings culture, and human capital in terms of the skills they have, their health, and their education, their degree and number of years of education. Then we also assess the physical capital, what is provided by the government, like good roads, electricity, water, basically infrastructure. Then we come to social capital. Social capital here we operationalize in terms of participation in the community and the belongingness to the community, especially in Mizoram, where we have a lot of associations for the youth, where women's associations, associations for senior citizens, so their participation, their amount and level of participation there, and the kind of help that they receive from the community. So all this we term as social capital. So what we found in their coping strategies is that a lot of these people, they're very poor. Their main source of income is daily wage labor, where the bread earner would bring home 300 or 500 rupees a day, and he has to feed 7 family members or so. So that is how, these children are all schooled, and with all the inflation and all, they face a lot of problem in the city, surviving in the city. So how do these people survive? So what they say is, like I mentioned, the hard work, the family cohesion and all that. But besides all these, what we have seen, what we have observed is that for each family, for each of these families, social support, social capital is seeing them through their poverty situation. And again, within social capital also, there are 2 types. One is the bonding capital and one is the bridging capital. Bonding capital, tribals and small communities we would understand, because close-knit societies, we bond a lot in the church, in the society, we know each other, especially in small localities, we know each other and we bond a lot. But this bonding itself does not promote the livelihood of any of these households. But in some of these cases, we find people who have trade with non-Mizos, who have been trading with non-Mizos, and through their trade, they acquire skills, how to better financially manage their households and their income. And then we also find one of these cases, we have a widow who, recalling her childhood, she says the British missionary Miss Katie Hugh had stayed in her house and had taught them how to make use of what little they have. So those are bridging capitals, where the bond is not just about emotional bonding, it's about exchanging skills, know-how and knowledge which would be beneficial for one's livelihood. So we found that social capital is very important to cope with poverty, and especially in Mizoram. So in the past, we found a lot of social support in Mizo society. We have Natlang, the community work, and this is all carried out in the spirit of Klongaina, or altruism, and where they would build the houses or repair the houses of people who are less deprived than themselves. And we find that till today, where in times of fire or a natural calamity, you see people coming together and supporting them in some way. Or we have Vebur, where you find people collecting money for someone or some family who has seen hard times. So we see a lot of that. We see this continuum of social support in Mizo society, in Mizo culture. And here I talk about Ma Kong Sian, making agricultural link roads, Tuikur Hia Sanghavwak and Lom, where they would take turns in helping each other in the agricultural field. So here, because my study is urban in nature, this is still found in some parts in the rural areas, but because we're talking about the urban area, we cannot bring that into our study. But what I also found is, though social support is the factor or the pillar that holds these families together in coping with their daily needs, we also found that there is a paucity of savings culture among the Mizos, and that illness and disability still affects their livelihood, their ability to work, and their ability to earn an income. And a very interesting finding is also that, because in poverty studies you'll always find a concept called feminization of poverty, where even in the past, the poor families were those families who were female-headed, perhaps due to death or divorce. But in my study, what I found is that not only female-headed families, but those families headed by males as well, they coped better when the mother of the household, the central figure in a household, has skills in financial management. So that is how they coped. And to conclude, I would say that despite the urban chaos, or despite the rapid urbanization and its resultant factors, let us say, we find that social support, social capital is still the basic coping strategy of these poor households in urban Mizoram. Thank you.
Very delighted to be among all of you to speak on, among others, a very few, very small topic which I specialize on. I specialize in child protection, and this is part and parcel of my, research. Of course, I made some adjustment because I wanted to link it with, this particular theme. Otherwise, in the abstract note, the title, I think, the little adjustment that we have to make. So, my topic will be on the Mizo child, retrospect and prospect. Basically, I will delve into how we see children traditionally and what is the position of children today based on the findings of my research, which was conducted quite recently. So, we have a customary law that speaks on issues relating specifically to child, care and protection. And also there are some other indications which of child protection itself. So here we know, you can see that quite surprisingly so, Mizoram customary law, like unlike other, customary laws, has been codified. And anyway, so these are some of the points, so we have, I think, just earlier, the speaker was talking about the Islam, which is very akin to our culture, which basically means community work. So in that area, we have actually exempted children, below the age of 15 years. But what we see is that in traditional times, just let me give some little bit of extension. In traditional times, as far as certain, literatures are concerned, we find that children have been actually initiated to adulthood quite early. I think we find this in other northeastern states also, where even in Naga you have the Moran boys dormitory. I think even in Manipur they have that. So, as early as 13 years old, basically, 12 to 13 years old, they are initiated to adulthood. So there is no scope for them to, actually experience a real, that fun thing that we know of as what a child should, enjoy. So and of course here also we often hear about Lamzui, but today we know that the church at least has actually kind of consented to the issues relating to Lamzui, where they have been given a proper funeral procession. But the more dominant YMA, the Young Mizo Association, has not yet actually approved that, a child that dies below, 3 months of age should be given that kind of status. And out here also, I think it speaks for itself in case regarding divorce, abandoned children, and all these provisions of child adoption, rules of guardianship and heirship. So from here we know that children, even though could be conceived as a being that were actually neglected, as far as the laws were concerned, our customs were concerned, there were indications of protection and care for them. Though here, even we know that even children born out of wedlock have been branded as an illegitimate child or son in the local language. A couple of literatures, studies made by, of course, some of our more prominent professors and academicians across Mizoram. So we see that in the Dept, which is a very famous tale of among the Mizos. From there we see that we see evidences of care given by Pifangi to the two abandoned brothers, and of course he has also, Thanboya has also indicated about how women actually comfort their children with native songs and rhymes and pass on traditional tales to their children orally. So, oral actually, this technique was also used in order to educate the children. And out here also we see that the birth of a girl child was hailed with joy, same way as a boy, you know. And Laurin Boy also said that Mizo children received education at home and in the more, the erstwhile boys dormitory called Zorbo. And Thang Min Lian also has also indicated in his study that Mizo chiefs provided food and shelter to widows and orphans. But out here we see that these widows and orphans would actually, you know, act as what we call today maids, or, you know, like, do some household chores. So they usually, it was kind of a, you know, quid pro quo thing. I'll give you shelter, I'll help you, but you have to work under me. So it was slavery of sorts in some way. Anyway, Lalpin Chada 2002 talks about in like in some festivals, you know, there were specific festivals for children called the Polkut. So surprisingly so, we also have in traditional times, you know, like festivals specifically meant for children. And Mizo girls were given the responsibility to do household chores, weaving, carrying firewood, and the boys were given the same, like, you know, apart from fishing and hunting. And here we also see that, you know, there were a couple of recreational, you know, local recreational activities that we have in traditional times, which today I think some of them is no more. You know, the few children do this because all of them are into the more gadgeted, you know, technological tools. So these are basically in knock. Would be, you know, like you lift up one leg and, you know, do that, and, you know, and all these things. Kalchat would be, you know, there's a tool, a bamboo, long bamboo tool, and they climb on top of that, and then they use bow like that. I think you find that in other cultures too. And maids have in Dacia would be, you know, the boys would be. These are actually meant for boys. You know, there were specific games meant for both boys and girls. And let me not go into details. So there were enough indications of, you know, like of recreational activities for children too. And in festival times, you know, like liquor, when we talk about liquor without that, what you call again, yeast, yes, were made for children during these festive times also. Okay, sorry. And Zulong and Rinzu, okay, and Sabebu is a kind of a food made from rice. Okay, so they were specifically made for children. And in terms of, you know, like what do you call abuse, or, you know, we find certain indications in studies that you know, children were scorned off, you know, like dogs not fit to be in the house. You know, these words are meant for children. And then some demeaning words. And also we see that in Iliadavate now, the same story that I indicated earlier, though it shows that a woman would have shown care. This particular, of course, Fiera Tui also, these particular tales, you know, highlighted more about the deplorable conditions of children, especially abandoned children or illegitimate children. And then Mizoram Liena and Lorinoma also in their book reveals that in traditional Mizo society, you know, mothers and fathers had little knowledge about child care. Children were threatened and ridiculed by adults, much to their disgrace. Children spent very little time with their families, except during, you know, like dinner, or, you know, and while sleeping, and they spend more times with their friends. And so this was the whole, you know, the whole picture of children during traditional times. And after the advent of the missionaries, you know, studies indicated that, you know, real, what kind of welfare services actually started in respect to education and health. So education and health were the two main areas where we could find, you know, like kind of, what do you call, models or real approaches to the care and protection of children. And after the 1920s, after this is also actually an offshoot of the initiative taken up by the Baptist missionaries today there is a little argument about who built a real home first. You know, the Baptists indicate that they were the first people that actually built a children's home, while the Salvation Army said that we were as early as 1924. But the Baptist missionaries said that we were as early as 1919. So there was an argument about this particular case, but nevertheless, we know that, you know, the real kind of welfare services started after, you know, the advent of the Christian missionaries, and then from there, different denominations started building homes, and they exist even till today, most of them. And the Emirate movement started, which kind of, you know, in certain studies, in Northeastern studies, we have seen a couple of cases where, you know, children as early as 16, 17, or even 15 or 14 were, abused by the army, and as a result of that, it led to a lot of mental health issue cases. You know, even till today, even though, like we were talking about, you know, the silence, people keep silent about this particular history. Only in one study, that actually conducted by Northeastern Research Center, if I'm not mistaken, I have that book with me. They have indicated some case studies of Mizoram women who were sexually assaulted as young girls during the. Yes, yes. Maybe a couple of studies are there, but not as much as we would, you know, like to till today. So I think our literatures have to be, you know, have to focus on that particular area. And as a result of that, this has led to a lot of, you know, a problem. And after Mizoram became a union territory, you know, studies indicated by Professor Lalkima, he indicated in his study that, you know, the huge fundings that suddenly came from the central government, increased scope for corruption, misuse of public money, and then these indirectly affected the family, and then which affected, you know, like which increased scope for the rise of many social problems such as alcoholism and drug addiction that started from 1970s. Okay, alcoholism started from early 1970s, and then from the late 70s to the 80s, drug addiction started. So, in that case, in my study conducted into 2014, what happened was that with these realities, the child became exposed to certain, you know, certain experiences far beyond what they could ever imagine. Okay, they were exposed to certain cases, and as a result of that, you know, their mental health, you know, has been affected tremendously. And in the present scenario today, maybe, see, I'm not very specific, okay, I'm just generally kind of giving you some points. Today, as far as my study reveals, we are talking about more than 70% of children in Mizoram have one or more mental health problems. Okay, I've used 4 categories to actually measure them. Okay, in terms of feeling of sadness, feeling of loneliness, anger, anxiety. Sorry, 5, and then of course suicidal ideations. Okay, based upon 5-point scales. Okay, so and then we are talking about, like I tell you today, 70% of the children. Okay, average. Talking about average of 70% having one or more mental health problems in Mizoram. So that is our situation today, and which we have to look upon whether, you know, the adult is it because of the adult population? Is it because, you know, our concern towards children, you know, is so less that they still feel, you know, like this way, or they're having certain issues related to what I have found in my particular research. I think these questions must, you know, stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry, for his piece.
I'm coming straight to half of my paper because I've written a lot about the historical review of the status of women in Mizoram. And then I want to focus on the legal aspect of what is happening today. And I have a big questions on this, because we speak in terms of Mizo customary laws or Mizo customary practices, and then we want to legalize them. And then finally, when it was enacted in 2014, with reference to inheritance, with reference to divorce, with reference to custody, and I have a feeling that the indigenous practice could be still a better solution for the women, in spite of the fact that we talk so much about the empowerment of women in our own context also. Now, I'm coming straight to that, and because I've spoken a lot about the traditional sayings and all that, which we all know, and some of us, which are quite popular today. Now, in the case of inheritance, for instance, let me just find my paper. They are full of in the customary, a monograph in the Lushai customs and ceremonies written by Perry, 1928. He has stated that, he has given that in inheritance, there is no, the women are not given any share to that. A woman, a wife, or anyone, a wife cannot inherit the property of her husband, etc., etc. Now, the Mizo, and then in the Department of Law, tried to come up with some kind of a modification of that customs and traditional practices, and with a view to legalizing it later on. Now, I'm just reading out the inheritance which is reflected in Perry 1928. It says, by tradition and practice, till date, all property revolves through males, and a man's direct heirs are his sons. If he has several sons, the youngest is the formal heir. If a man has enough property to divide among the sons, he does so, but the youngest son gets the bulk of the ancestral property and is expected to look after his parents in old age. And Perry in 1928 writes that if a widow is left with small sons, although her sons are the direct heirs, she usually has to go to one of her husband's male relation to take over the estate on behalf of her infant sons. Because maintaining family by a single woman, if the children were still young, was next to impossible. Unless they get control of the estate, her husband's relatives are unlikely to be willing to help her, etc. Now, as a rule, no woman can inherit property, but if, thus if a man dies without any heirs, his daughter would inherit before the widow, etc. Now, in the draft of the Mizo customary laws of inheritance, drafted by the Department of Law, they have this stated that among the sons who are direct heirs, the youngest son is the former heir. If a son, the former heir, dies before his parents, his sons will be the direct heir, etc. If the deceased doesn't have a son, then his daughter can inherit. So there is no mention of the wife or the widow in the inheritance. Now the MHE, EP, was a women organization, famous women organization, has suggested a change while this draft is being prepared by the Department of Law. And then they suggested that the widow of the deceased be included and her position as heir to her husband's property be specified. And the new enacted law has no provision for that. Although it says a wife can inherit, but funnily what happens is that the widow, if her children are grown up, her children has to give her the license to be the head of the family. Only then she can have some say into the property, right? And not only that, what is very biased about this is that what happens to the kind of property that could be shared between the husband and the wife in the event of divorce or in the event of death. It's stated very specifically acquired property. Okay? So this has so many loopholes. We have been trying to look into it, discussing it in several forums and trying to initiate the MHEP so that this enactment of the Mizoram Divorce and Inheritance of Property Act be, reviewed again. So what happens is that the acquired property could be interpreted in so many ways. Now, if the wife is a simple housewife, and in the court of law, she can be accused of not contributing to the acquired property. Okay? There's so many loopholes in that. And if this is a simple and educated wife, she can be, it can be said that she has no hand in the acquired property, etc., if she doesn't have to work. So there are so many things that have to be taken care of in this also, and a number of cases are pending in the court right now also. So, and then, so as I've said, like for a wife to inherit or to be in one of the inheritance law over here, which was enacted in 2014, on the death of the head of the family, the wife will automatically become the head of the family if she remains a chaste widow. Look at the kind of adjectives that they use. If she remains a chaste widow and looks after the welfare of her minor children, if the children have become majors, she needs to obtain no objection from the children to recognize her as the head of the family. This is the new act, and this is what is going to be used in the court of law. Okay? So such things are taking place even in the, and then when it comes to the inheritance of the husband of his wife's property, okay, it says, if a woman predeceased her husband, her personal property will devolve to her surviving husband. Okay, you can see the biases over here even in the thing. And then I want to talk about a divorce. Here in Mizo we have Ma, that is the husband side will divorce the wife, and then Sumswa, the wife will give the price back, and then Konka Sulamak and all that is there. But in the new act, it says that right of a woman leaving her husband on Sumswa. Okay? And then there's some mention of the kind of property that she could also inherit. Again, it is enclosed with the phrase acquired property. Okay, so acquired property is a key word over here. And then the reasons for leaving her husband could be domestic violence, infidelity, on health grounds, and insanity. Only these four are mentioned. And a wife has to divorce her husband not only on these four grounds. Okay? There are so many factors that come into play. What about what we call marrying mama's boy? Okay? What about a husband not being violent, etc.? Because we have cases recently in the Women's Commission where with this new law, people have become so conscious that there is a couple who has separated, and each of the family, both of them are very, very aware of this new thing. So the husband doesn't want to divorce her on what we call on mark basis, okay? And then the wife doesn't want to divorce her husband on sum tuak either. So it's like, they're waiting for each other to make the move because it involves property also. And then what we have heard is that the parents of the husband have been they have been so careful by changing whatever property or some plot of land that he has back into their names. So that whatever strategy that the wife would later on apply, all right, they could save their property like that. So, and then another one is that there's a divorce. They've been married about 3 years like that and no issue, and so the wife has gone through fertility test and the husband refused to do it. Okay? Now, he refused to do it, and when he's being asked to do it, he resorts to drinking. And no violence is committed by him against his wife. But he just stopped communicating to his wife. So the wife cannot marry a vegetable like that. So she's forced to leave him. So they're deciding now whether to use the word, to use the process of sum tuak or mark now. So what I'm trying to say over here is that there are so many loopholes in this new act that it's creating a lot of problems for the more educated people who are, aware of this. And later on, we love, creating awareness everywhere, and then the lesser educated would be also educated on this, and there's going to be a lot of problems. So my stand for this today is that indigenous practices, sometimes which occur on a mutual basis, isn't it better than complicating, in the name of law? That is what I'm trying to argue today. And then in the case of an illegitimate child, as they have all said before, now we call it a child out of a wedlock because we want to be more polite, and then there is no mention in this act. Although MHP now, in order to say that I'm the father of the child, a boy's family would go and give ₹40 to the girl's family in the past. And the MHAP is said that the amount is too little, so it should be increased to some 4,000 rupees, like that. But the law drafter or whoever are not paying any heed to this, and there's no mention, and the price of an illegitimate child is still rupees 40 here. Okay? So, and then also custody of children. Now, it has become very complicated now. In the past, there is no such thing as, okay, if they are sons, sometimes the husband's family would say, he is my offspring, so I have to be a custodian of the children after divorce, all that kind of thing, but sometimes it's always mutually settled. Okay? But now this one said that till 3 years, till the child is 3 years of age, the child will be with the mother. And then it simply said the rest will be settled by the court. How it's going to settle it? Because it's specifically mentioned about the right of the mother, that is up to 3 years. Okay, so that means that this child, for instance, after he has reached the age, past the age of 3 years, would legally perhaps automatically go to his father, you know, and that is how the court, I suppose, would settle it, because it doesn't have mention of the choice of the children, although MHAP has suggested this to be included. Okay, so what I'm trying to say over here, that I'm making it very simple, because though there are so many things in terms of divorce, in terms of property division, for example, and the percentage, it's never 50-50, okay, between husband and wife. Even if in the case of acquired property, it's 25-75 like that. So you see the biases over there all the time, and then what I'm trying to argue is that when we talk about modernity, when we talk about modernization, when we talk about legal awareness, and when we talk about what the other countries, our neighbors, are practicing in terms of what is, you know, so in terms of what is supposed to be very good for us, you know, it could be something very negative for us also. And then for women itself, although we are trying to empower them, although we are trying to, bring them up to a status of equality with our fellow men, for example, with the male group, for example, such enactment of law, which is now legal, could be a disempowering factor for the women. And also, I have these big questions. I really want to look into it again, like indigenous practices, customs, you know. Let us really look at it again and see. Because in those practices and those customs, most of the time things are settled on a mutual basis. So wouldn't that be a better option for us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Indigeneity Fan. We will have the question session, hopefully 15 minutes after everybody has presented. I shall open the sessions after all the papers are done. Now we shall go according to this. I will invite now Larenki Maralte. His paper is on political identity and the construction of difference in the MNF.
Thank you. My paper is on, particularly I shall be focusing on how the MNF constructed their claim for a separate identity during the 1960s, and how they formed a difference against the nation state, the Indian state, I should say. I think if we, some of us, if we go through last night LPS local channel, we would see that Mizoram Thanga, the president of the Mizoram National Front Party, was urging the Mizoram people to witness the golden jubilee year of the declaration of the MNF independence movement, that is on 1st March of this year. It is well known, very well known, that MNF Peace Accord, which was signed in 1986, was one of the most successful accords that was ever signed in India. I would like to revisit this particular MNF case because the way they are shaping the identity of the Mizo is quite interesting, and particularly I have chosen from the books written by the MNF leaders like Pulal Dena, the founder president of the MNF, Mizoram March Towards Freedom, Pulal Bingthanga, the former foreign secretary of the MNF underground government, so to say, Problem of Peace Making in Mizoram, Puzoram Thanga, Zoram Zalena Lungpum, the cornerstone of Zoram freedom, if literally translated, and Puar Zamoya, the first defense minister of the MNF, Zofa Tesitkonga Zalena May Amit Turanilo. So it's all about freedom, freedom against the state, the existing state. So to go through the way they shape the identity of the Mizo, I would like to first read some portion of the MNF Declaration of Independence, which they declared on 1st March 1996. Here they have written that in the course of human history, it becomes invariably necessary for mankind to assume their social, economic, and political status to which the law of the nature and nature God entitles them. We hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with inalienable fundamental human rights and dignity of human person. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, driving their just power from the consent of the governed. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive, its end, it is the right of the people to alter, change, modify, and abolish it, and to institute a new government and laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to their rights and dignity. The Mizo, created and molded into a nation and nurtured as such by nature's God, have been they are being dominated by the people of India in contravention of the nature of law. We also see here that to conceal the evil and selfish design of religious assimilation, that is Christianity, and Hindu indoctrination they preach to have established, we cannot accept as it leads to suppression of Christianity itself. And in this very Declaration of Independence, they have given 12 points in which they want to become that the Mizo people should be independent of the Indian state. I shall read out the important points which they see. Number one is, they have instituted government to rule over us in our own country, that is Mizoram, without any respect for human rights and dignity, even in the face of the present candid world which is committed to us. Number two, they have been pursuing a policy of exploitative measures in their attempt to wipe out Christianity, sole religion, and no consideration has even been paid to our national way of life. Number three, they have been preaching throughout the world as if they have instituted a separate administrative machinery in conformity with the principles of democracy to conceal their policy of degeneration and our national morality and of assimilation. Well, what has been instituted for us is a pattern of colonial administration. Here, what they refer to is the district council administration that was during the 1960s. And I shall read out another 2 points. In spite of our repeated appeal for peaceful settlement of our rightful and legitimate demand for full self-determination, the government of India is bringing exploitative and subversive measures, employing their military might and waging war against us, as done in the case of the Nagas and the Kashmiris. Owing to the absence of medical facilities in our country, our people died without having medical treatment and attention. For these and other innumerable causes, we declare that we are independent. So, particularly when we talk about this MNF Declaration of Independence, we tend to see there are two things which they created the Mizo identity. First is on the right to self-determination of the Mizo community as a separate political identity, and secondly, they see the Indian state as a colonial state which imposed its laws upon the Mizo. So particularly what I'm trying to do is that I shall particularly try to focus on these two objectives and see how they are good from the leaders' arguments itself. As for the former foreign minister of the MNF, who Lalmingtha had written in his book that Mizo belongs to the Mongoloid race of Tibeto-Burman stock migrating from the southern part of China, and he narrates those various kinds of that the Mizo clans are being united together, and that they are being different from the bordering community. And Pu Laltenga, the founder president of the MNF, also had argued that though the British colonialists has called them Pukis or Chin or any other, Mizo is a separate and distinct nation from that of India, Burma, and Pakistan. And the people, having been created, molded, and nurtured by God and nature as a separate, never identify themselves as Indian, Burmese, or Pakistani. What particularly they base here is that they go back to the text given by G.A. Gresham, the way he classified them, the Puki, Chin, Mizo people. And in those times, the land, before 1954, it was known as the Lusai Hills. So particularly what they were doing was that the main text they based was on the colonial text, and what resembles is that some of the way they argued resembles the argument given by J. Shakespeare in his book, the Lusai Kuki Clan, and G.A. Gresham book. And the point where they took their the Mizo identity as a given identity was from the Chin Lusai Conference of 1892, and in which the colonial administrator had a conference in Calcutta, considering the nature of these people, so-called Kuki, Chin, and Lusai. And what they recommended that at that period was that they opined that it is very desirable that the whole tract of the country, known as Chin Lusai Hills, should be brought under one administrative head as soon as this can be done. So particularly when they identify the Mizo as a separate identity was from the point where the British administrator came and subdued the various Mizo clans. Before that, what they trace is that all the Mizo clans were somewhat like semi-independent or independent in their own sphere of village life. And they traces that through common origin, the practice of Tlongaina and the practice of so-called head hunting and the others, which common customs and all. So basing on that, they were trying to give Mizo a new identity. And what they see here is that during the 1940s, when the British colonial power left Mizoram, what they see is that almost in their books, there was hardly any negative remarks on the colonial rule. And if we look in another book written by K. Hall Silo, he was also former underground. The title of his book is also Golden Rule of the Lusai Hills, in which he argued that the golden period of Mizoram was when till 1947. So particularly, so it's somewhat like a glorification of the past, how the MNF constructed the identity of the Mizo. And secondly, the reason, what seems to be the reason that they saw the Indian state as a colonial state was that during the 1950s, there was a structural adjustment in the administrative setup. Both the chiefs in each village were functioning as a head of the village, and the government also had been empowered to do certain kind of governance. There was both as they are good. It was somewhat like for them an instrument. The changing structure of the political situation, moving towards a democratic system was somewhat like an instrument for the Indian government to subdue the existing Mizo identity from changing towards a separate identity to the district council. When the district council emerged, it somewhat like seems to them, for them, a puppet government, because they fear that the Mizo society community would not be able to see themselves through the lens of those structural adjustments. And okay, I will end up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry Marate. We shall now invite the next paper. This is a paper that is to be read in absentia, a paper written by Boniface Kaikundung Kame, Orality and Transcription in Naga Society, and it is to be presented in absentia by Vilarin Sangi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will read out the paper of Boniface Kame on his behalf. The paper is titled Orality and Transcription in Naga Society. All the societies in the world started as an oral society, and it was in the oral medium mankind had pickled their origin, history, social, cultural practices, and religion. The forms of oral literature are myth, poetry, folktale, and folk song. Of these forms of oral literature, myth plays a critical role in the history of human civilization, as history is incomplete without myth. Carl Jung, in his psychological approach to oral literature, theorizes symbols in myths as archetype. Jung defines symbols in oral literature as projection of ancient images and emotions in the collective unconsciousness, a collectively inherited unconsciousness that becomes the patterns of behavior. For the Nagas, their myths trace the origin from stones. The stones in the Naga myths are archetypes and symbols which represent a behavior pattern which the Nagas inherited from their earliest ancestors, thus reiterating their common origin of the staggering diverse tribe. But now there is somber discontinuity with this magical stage. The Naga stories continues to be an oral history, even though it has achieved literacy in the last quarter of the 19th century after the arrival of the American Baptist Mission Society. The Nagas' quest for self-determination and the subsequent action of the Indian government to suppress the self-determination movement led to the imposition of several brutal draconian military laws such as the Assam Maintenance of Public Order, Nagaland Security Regulation Act, and Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA. These laws threatened the survival of every Naga in the turbulent years of fervent nationalism, bloodshed, and disillusionment that make up the history of the Nagas in the second half of the last century. Mass burning of villages, public execution, torturing and killing of civilians, rape and grouping of villages in camps were the various forms of atrocities inflicted on the Nagas. These stories of human rights violation remain unknown to the rest of the world because of the censorship imposed on the media by the government of India, except for a few people like Gavin Young and Reverend Michael Scott, who have reported fragments of the history of Nagas' human rights violation. For communities that have been subjected to unbearable violent realities like slavery, Holocaust, annihilation of ethnic group, the only source of cultural transmission is oral testimony. Toni Morrison, in her novel Beloved, introduced the concept of rememory, quote unquote, to resurrect the history of black slavery experience. Morrison described rememory as an act of remembering and re-participating in a past that are now experienced differently. Rememory is an orally derived perception of the workings of memory, and it is a key to unlocking a past that rational memory has repressed. Rememory is not a solipsistic process, but rather it involves a community dialectically understanding and accepting the political and social condition under which they live. Temsula Au's short stories collection, These Hills Called Home, is a work of memory, as she writes in her preface, lest we forget, open quotation, in these stories I have endeavored to revisit the life of those people whose pain has far gone unmentioned and unacknowledged, close quotation. Temsula Au's short stories, The Last Song and An Old Man Remembers, have oral memory as its narrative principle. The stories revolve around the memories of the victims and the witnesses of trauma and people who have lost their life in the Indo-Naga War. An Old Man Remembers tells the story of Intisashi, who rememorizes the turbulent years of bloodshed and his involvement in the Naga armed national movement. His repressed memory was provoked by the sudden death of his friend Imli Kokba, who felt that Naga history needs to be told to the present generation, and by his grandson Mo, who has become scathing of self-determination as a terror and an extortionist movement. In the story, The Last Song, an old woman retells a group of young students the horrific story of Apenyo, who was raped and killed in a village massacre by the Indian Army for paying taxes to the underground. These true stories are oral in terms of theme, structure, and in expression, and they highlight the transition of a society from oral to literary, but also show the profound influence of the oral mode of narrating in the written. Rememory reconstructs a past that has never been preserved in the literary form. Intisashi, the protagonist of the story An Old Man Remembers, joined the Naga nationalism. But as the movement becomes disappointing and disillusioned, Sashi deranges himself from the history. Sashi has always fought against the memories of the hellish atmosphere in the wake of Naga nationalism and repressed the specters of the past, though it continued to haunt him. Despite his maimed leg that reminded of his involvement in the Indo-Naga conflict, his wife's attempt to get him to talk about the haunting violent past, and his best friend Imli Kokba's persuasion to use his oratory power to tell the people's history. He refused to narrate the past to the young living generation and transmit the horror recorded in his memory. Sashiri memory reconstructs a past that was repressed in collective unconscious memory of the community because the horror of war was too painful. Ruminating his recorded memory, Sashiri collected how a generation of people lived their life in a seemingly endless cycle of beatings, rapes, burning of villages, forced labor, grouping of villages and running from one hideout to another in the deep jungles to escape the pursuing Indian army. Sashi's real memory is subjective and personal, and it is only a fragment of the many fragments that commemorate a history. Unlike the common trope in the Naga literature, where a Naga would voluntarily join the national movement for the love of their ancestral land to protect their people, culture, and selfhood, Sashi's real memory gives another dimension to the Naga's story. Imti Sashi and his friend Imni Koppa eluding the Indian army, attacking their village, shelter in the jungle only to have their destiny intercepted by a group Naga army. Sashi's subjective perspective of the Indo-Naga conflict provides another lens to look at the history. To quote Sashi's concluding memory, open quotation, "Our youth was claimed by the turbulence, which transformed boys like Imli and me into killers. Yes, we did kill many people, but the truth is that till today I cannot say how I feel about that, which sometimes makes me wonder if I have turned into a monster. What I have just revealed to you was the most painful to bear, because it was a constant reminder of our lost youth." Close quotation. The short story, The Last Song, is an oral testimony that highlights that in times of conflict, the worst sufferers are women. The story is a critique of how AFSPA literally gives unlimited power to the security forces over the lives of ordinary citizens, and in the name of fighting insurgency, they are not tired for the crimes against humanity. This act has the power to silence the voices of the victims, and the unbearable reality gets repressed as a collective unconscious of the community as time elapsed and generations pass. The Last Song narrates the story of Apenyo, who was raped and killed in a village massacre by the Indian army. The story opens on one auspicious day dedicated to the inauguration of the new church building. Apenyo was a talented singer. On this auspicious day, she was supposed to sing a solo in the new church before the ironical, horrific turn of events. This horrific massacre of the village in the church was silenced by the armed force using threat. The abuse of power can be seen in the following lines. Open quotation, "The visiting pastors were left alone when it became known that they did not belong to this village, but they were ordered to leave immediately and threatened in no uncertain terms that if they carried the news of what had happened here, their own villages would suffer the same fate." Close quotation. The only subversive act against the horrific attack was Apenyo's song that haunted the captain who raped her and continued to be heard in the village years after the incident, reminding the eyewitnesses of the horrific day as a paranormal story longing for the present generation to be told of the past. The story has two narrative voices, one of the third-person narrative and the other an eyewitness of the incident, narrating the incident to the present generation who are ignorant about the past. The narrative structure shows the power of the oral in reconstruction of history. Tamsula Ao's short stories can be argued to be an attempt of historiographic intervention, strategically centering her stories sources from the oral memories of those who have survived the political and military oppression. She is presenting an alternate history of historically disposed Nagas. Our stories are a manifestation of oral history. It attempts to reconstruct history, and in the process it strengthens one's own identity by an understanding of one's history. The painful recollection of painful repressed memories is a therapeutic process as it transforms and provides catharsis to the victims. The personal traumatic experience is freed from the mind during confession, and it becomes a story of the society and a collective burden that the community should share. Imtisashi had spent his life attempting to avoid encounters with his past. It was only when he confronted the past he could extricate himself from the fear of the past and began to live freely and peacefully in the present. Sashi is transformed from the monstrous self that Indo-Naga conflict had made him, and his humanity is restored. Apenyo's resistance and death with her mother would be only, open quotation, tiny grassy knolls on the perimeter of village graveyard. And if one is not familiar with the history of the village, particularly about what happened on the dreadful Sunday 30-odd years ago. One can easily miss these two monks trying to stay above ground level, close quotation. Through romantic retelling of Apenio's resistance and subsequent death in a super-realist form, Apenio is immortalized and her resistance and death along with fellow villagers are glorified. Apenios represent the whole of women folk who were violated and killed in the conflict zone. And to conclude the paper, what the paper attempts to study is the relevance of memory in the reconstruction of history and the dialectical approach that memory provides to understand history of those people whose written history is either missing or distorted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah and Sami. For the next paper, the last paper for this session, I shall call upon Dr. K. Silal Kamani and Dalrod Moy to present their paper. Their paper is entitled An Eco-Feminist Reading of Selected Mizoram Folklore.
As this is a joint paper, Dalrod Moy will read out the paper.
Thank you. An Eco-Feminist Reading of Selected Mizoram Folklore. I will just start reading now. The position of women in Mizo society has been a much debated subject. While some writers and historians believe that Mizo women did not receive any abuse or mistreatment from their male counterparts in the society, on the other hand, there are many who believe that women occupy a much lesser place in the society as compared to men, and that they are dominated and oppressed by the patriarchal Mizo society. Even though most writers accept the fact that the position of women has improved with the introduction of Christianity and the advent of education that comes along with it, continuance of practices like the bride price, howsoever symbolic, is a proof. Ecofeminists believe that ecological crisis and the oppression of women is a result of patriarchal values and practices that dominated all other beings, human and non-human. In her essay, Living Interconnections with Animals and Nature, Greta wrote that, open quotation, drawing on the insights of ecology, feminism, and socialism, ecofeminism's basic premise is that the ideology which authorizes oppression, such as those based on race, class, gender, sexuality, physical abilities, and species, is the same ideology which sanctions the oppression of nature, close quotation. Like any other patriarchal society, men are the ones who hold the power over women in Mizo society, especially during the pre-Christian era, which this paper will mainly focus on. Women were expected to follow the dictates of the society, which ensured that power remained in the hands of men. For example, in the case of a divorce, even though it was frowned upon, a divorced man did not have to endure public censure while the woman was looked down upon. Reverend V.S.L. Renoma talked about this bias practice in the Mizo society in his book Mizo Ethos, Changes and Challenges, open quotation. A man was at liberty to replace his wife if he thought she no longer served his purpose. Perhaps this thinking gave birth to a number of divorce cases in the primitive Mizo society. Divorce was taken very lightly. A divorced man was not looked down upon, whereas a divorced woman was looked down upon, close quotation. Mizo ethos is reflected in the rich folklore passed down from generation after another orally. Folklore represents the ideals, dreams, traditions of a particular society and provided a great opportunity to study the past, which is undeniably linked with the present. The two folklore that I have selected for this paper are the famous folktales of Zolpalay and Tualvinye and Mangwangi, who managed to rise above her life's troubles through sheer hard work and by possessing a good heart, qualities that are expected of an ideal Mizo woman. At the same time, reading these two folktales from an eco-feminist point of view reveals certain binaries, though not limited to them only, such as man versus woman, man versus nature, and human versus animal. The tale of Zolpalay and Tualvungi has different versions, as is typical of folktales. Tualvungi was famed for her beauty and a chief from the plains named Punjia, which was addressed as Vainal in many versions, was quite fascinated with her. Punjia was quite fascinated with her. When he came to see her, he asked her husband who she was. Zolpala told him that she was his sister. In some version, it was said that Zolpala did not dare to tell Punjia that she was his wife, because he was afraid that he might have him killed, while in some version it was because he was very proud of his wife's beauty. Whatever the reason was, Punjia asked him what he demanded for her bride price since he was very interested in marrying her. Zolpala demanded an exorbitant bride price, which he thought was so unreasonable that Punjia would never be able to come up with it. However, Punjia came back to their village with the demands that Zolpala thought were impossible for him to acquire. Even though Tolbungi cried and did not want to live with Punjia, Zolpala had given his sword and couldn't back out of it. Throughout this whole episode, in none of these versions that Tolbungi did say anything except her reluctance to leave when she saw Punjia on his way with his followers. Nobody asked her whether or not she wanted to marry him. The whole thing was done between the two men, who never asked for her opinion in the matter. This told us that women did not have much control over their own life, and that their fate lies in the hands of the men in their lives, their fathers and their brothers, and when they get married, their husbands. And if the men in their lives made a decision, there was not much that they could do. There is even an old saying, crab's meat is not a meat, a woman's word is not a word. This lack of power and voice in their personal life can be traced in their social life as well. When the young men in a village could dismantle the house of a young woman, when or if any one of them thought that she disrespected him by word or deed. Thus, like any other patriarchal society, Mizo society was controlled by men where women were basically silent and powerless. In another folk tale called Maurangi, this lack of regard for women can be seen as well. When Maurangi's parents were crossing a bridge one day, her father said to his mother that whoever is afraid to cross the bridge on their way back from work shall be pushed off, when she mentioned that the bridge was very unsafe and dangerous. And with a heavy load, when her mother was scared to cross the bridge on their way home, her father actually pushed her off the bridge, a crime for which he was never accounted for. And it turned out that he killed his wife because he was having an affair with another woman, their neighbor, whom he married shortly. The subjugation of women was extended to the animals as well. In the pre-Christian Mizo society, it was believed that a man has to kill certain specific animals to enter Fiaral after death, their version of heaven. It is not hard to see that, like women, animals were seen as subservient to men, a means to an end, a different entity, the other, which man can take advantage of to improve his own status. Their general attitude can be perceived from their treatment of the animals in these folktales. When Zolpala passed away after being poisoned by Punjia, the people needed a messenger to inform Tolbungi of his demise. First, a crab came and they asked if it could relay the message to her and how. And when its answer was not what they wanted, they stepped on it, and that is why a crab walked like it does sideways till today, according to the folktale. A crow came next and they asked if it knew how to call Tolbungi, and the answer, ko, did not please him either, and thus they poured black dye on it and the crow turned black. Next came a bulbul, and when its answer wasn't what they were looking for yet again, they impaled it on a fence and it died. This is why a bulbul's feather under its tail is red. At last a wood pigeon came, and its answer when they asked if it would know how to tell Tolbungi of Zolpala's demise finally pleased the villagers, and they fed the bird with rice and meat and sent it on its way. In the other story, Maurangi's mother turned into a large catfish after she was pushed off the bridge by her husband. One day, Maurangi, being treated miserably by her stepmother, came to the river where she died. Her mother found her and they told each other their misfortunes. Then her mother fed her with delicious rice and fish. Maurangi soon became healthy and rosy, even though she always refused to eat the horrible food that her stepmother served her. When her stepmother found out that her mother, in the form of a catfish, used to feed her, she asked her husband to organize a hunt with the other villagers. Then the whole village came out to catch the catfish, but Maurangi kept telling her mother how to escape from them. They finally gagged her and led her away. Maurangi then buried her mother's heart, which grew into a tree called Punsong. After the tree grew up and bloomed, Maurangi would sing a song underneath, and the branches would lean down so she could drink the nectar from the flowers. However, when her stepmother discovered her secret, she had the tree felled by her husband and his friends. The actions of the people against the animals in the story of Zolpala and Tolbungi revealed that the animals' ability to feel pain was never taken into consideration. If they were of use to them, they were given preferential treatment. However, if they did not serve the needs of the humans, they were given severe punishment. In Maurong's mother's case, for the community who never questioned the details of her death, killing her in the form of fish or a tree does not seem to cause them much discomfort. It seemed that in a world where a man could murder his wife instead of simply divorcing her when he got tired of her, nobody questioned the hunt of a catfish and the felling of a tree. Viewed from an ecofeminist standpoint, in the pre-Christian Mesopatriarchal system, as mentioned before, women and nature represented in the folktales by the animals and the tree were not men, and thus were considered to be inferior and different, which justified their oppression and exploitation. In modern day Mizo society, even though women's position has much improved since the pre-Christian era, in the case of an unplanned pregnancy, a man could still get away scot-free by paying 40 rupees to the woman's family, which many things were clarified by Dr. Larry in her paper, so I won't go too much into that. So the paper is simply trying to say that the ecological crisis, the environmental crisis that we have been facing, that we are facing today, is linked with the oppression of women, which justify the oppression of other living beings, human or non-human, because of the androcentric and patriarchal practices of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I congratulate all the panelists, paper presentations of this session for their wonderful papers. I will not dwell into an expose of their papers. I think they were very lucid, very informative. We will now open time for the questions. And we have questions asked for the papers presented by Dr. Larinki Marate and Dr. K.C. Lathamani and Narwadmoy, and Boniface Kame's paper, because it was presented in absentia, no questions will be asked there. If comments are to be made on that, then we will open that as well. I will now open the floor for questions.